Hello and welcome. My name is Rika Lotzi, and I would like to thank you on joining into this podcast on EU-Japan Region and Cluster Cooperation. This podcast is a condensed version of the full report which you can find on our website. During this podcast, I will explain the background and the aim of the research first. Thereafter, I will discuss the main research outcomes. I will talk about general findings and trends regarding EU-Japan Region and Cluster Cooperation. I will give an example of a case study highlighted in the report. I will discuss the findings on underlying drivers for and challenges faced during EU-Japan Region and Cluster Cooperation, as well as benefits for SMEs involved. Lastly, I will discuss some advices for organizations promoting such types of cooperation. Japan and the EU have developed solid diplomatic and trading relationships since the 1990s. With respect to industry cooperation, a regulatory cooperation joint agreement was adopted in 2015, and in technology cooperation, an EU-Japan Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement was signed in 2009. On 17th of July 2018, the Economic Partnership Agreement between the EU and Japan was signed. It is the biggest trade deal that the EU has signed to date. It represents nearly 30% of the global GDP and 40% of global trade. It is also the largest open trade zone in the world, covering 600 million people. The cooperation allows for better mutual understanding of respective policies, including those related to small businesses and government procurement. On the same date, a strategic partnership agreement between the EU and Japan was signed as well. This partnership agreement is the first ever bilateral framework agreement between the EU and Japan. It aims to ensure closer political and economic cooperation on a whole host of bilateral, regional, and multilateral issues. Another partnership agreement signed recently between the EU and Japan is a partnership on sustainable connectivity and quality infrastructure. This partnership was signed on 27th of April 2019. This partnership portrays the willingness of the EU and Japan to work together on all dimensions of connectivity, including EU-Japan cooperation in third countries. In research and innovation, the EU and Japan work together through a co-funding scheme under the Japan Science and Technology Agency and Horizon 2020. So why region and cluster cooperation? In this context, the EU-Japan Center for Industrial Cooperation, which promotes all forms of industrial, trade, and investment cooperation between the EU and Japan with a focus on SMEs, seeks to promote EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation as well as EU-Japan cooperation in third countries in order to fully exploit the partnership agreements mentioned before. Now, regions and clusters play an important role in the development of SMEs. Interregional and interclustering initiatives are a few of the many agents supporting SMEs to grow and internationalize, as SMEs in most cases do not have the network, the know-how, and the resources to internationalize on their own. Meanwhile, the European Center for Japanese Studies in Alsace in the EU, together with the prefectures Gifu and Iwate in Japan, recently developed the EU-Japan Regional Cooperation Help Desk. The objective is to promote cooperation in terms of industry, trade, investment, innovation, tourism, and people mobility through a platform mobilizing EU regions and clusters and Japanese prefectures and clusters. Cooperation will be bilateral between European and Japanese stakeholders, but it may also include EU and Japanese stakeholders jointly operating in third countries, such as countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the EU's neighboring countries. Against this backdrop, it is important to understand the current state of EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation. The objective of the research was to provide an analysis of the practices, successes, and challenges of existing EU-Japan region-to-region, cluster-to-cluster, and region-to-cluster cooperation. Moreover, to support existing region and cluster cooperation and to improve industrial collaboration for SMEs, the research also aimed to investigate the benefits for SMEs participating in such cooperation schemes. Hereby, the focus was on cooperation within the field of regional innovation and business networks. The reason for this focus was that cooperation in regional innovation and business networks are one of the useful tools to enhance the quality of research output in both the EU and Japan, thus enhancing the global competitiveness of both the EU and Japan, as well as the SMEs participating in the cooperation schemes. Finally, the report aimed to give the Center and similar organizations practical advice on ways to improve this type of cooperation. The methodology used for the study included the review of existing online reports and the conduction of a survey and interviews with Japanese and EU stakeholders. Case studies highlighted in the report were selected based on their relevance, the existence of strong interest in long-term continuation of the cooperation, and the involvement of SMEs in the cooperation scheme. The advisory chapter highlights the most requested services by the survey respondents and the gaps between supply and demand of support services offered by the center. The methodology used for this part of the study consists of the review of existing online reports and the conduction of a survey with Japanese and EU stakeholders. In the report, first, EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation identified by online reports and papers were discussed. Then, the existence and characteristics of and interests in EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation were discussed based on the survey results. Stakeholders were selected on the basis of their internationalization strategy and therefore have a higher disposition to hold the EU-Japan agreement. In the following part of the podcast, I will discuss the main findings of the general analysis of EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation. 28% of the EU survey respondents indicated that they are engaged in EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation with at least one Japanese entity. The majority of cooperation counterparts of EU survey respondents were Japanese prefectures, followed by clusters. Activities within the cooperation scheme as mentioned by EU survey respondents most often revolved around business and commerce cooperation activities. These activities include business matchmaking, business missions, and market access and distribution assistance. The second frequently mentioned type of activity was information exchange, including, apart from exchanging information, organizing seminars, workshops, and networking events, and providing education and training. This type of activity was followed by joint R&D projects, organizing conferences and trade fairs, political and non-political delegation visits, and cultural exchanges. On the Japanese side, 57% of the survey respondents indicated that they are engaged in EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation activities with at least one EU entity. The majority of cooperation counterparts of Japanese survey respondents were EU clusters, followed by other types of entities such as national business and investment agencies, trade show organizations, research institutes, and municipalities. EU regions or regional agencies were not mentioned as cooperation counterparts by Japanese survey respondents. Activities within the cooperation schemes mentioned by Japanese survey respondents most often revolved around business and commerce cooperation activities as well. The second frequently mentioned type of activity was information exchange and joint R&D projects, followed by political and non-political delegation visits and cultural exchanges. Interesting to note is that amongst the EU survey respondents who indicated that they are not currently engaged in EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation, 83% indicated to be interested in cooperating with Japanese prefectures and/or clusters. On the other hand, amongst the Japanese survey respondents who indicated that they are not currently engaged in EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation, none would be interested in cooperation with EU regions and/or clusters. The reason for their disinterest was that they do not have a strategic focus on the EU for cooperation. During the research, several interviews with EU as well as Japanese survey respondents who indicated to be engaged in EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation have been conducted in order to gain more in-depth knowledge about their cooperation. The most relevant and successful case studies are highlighted in the report in the case studies section. They were chosen based on the following criteria. 1. Cooperation activities concern region-to-region, cluster-to-cluster, or region-to-cluster cooperation. 2. A strong interest in long-term cooperation is identified. And 3. SMEs are actively involved in the cooperation. Other types of relevant cooperation identified by the survey and the interviews are discussed in the report as well, but in a different section. Next, due to the length of the podcast, I will discuss one highlighted case study mentioned in the report. This example is a case study in the region-to-region cooperation category and concerns the cooperation between the city-state of Hamburg and Fukushima Prefecture. For this case study, an interview with two members of the Authority for Economic Affairs, Transport and Innovation within the Senate of the Free and HANSEATIC city-state of Hamburg was conducted. The cooperation between Hamburg and Fukushima began in 2012 with an energy industry fact-finding mission by the city-state of Hamburg to Tokyo right after the Fukushima disaster with the help of METI, NEDO and TEPCO. At the time, Hamburg was the first entity to meet Japanese political stakeholders after the Fukushima disaster, and it was able to promise fruitful collaboration with Japanese entities in the field of renewable energy. The underlying driver for the state of Hamburg to visit Japan was that Germany and Japan had a trustworthy relationship in advance. A long diplomatic and trade relationship between the two countries has resulted in the Japanese trusting German collaboration counterparts and Germans having sympathy for Japanese collaboration counterparts in general. After the first visit, Hamburg and Fukushima began cooperating on a regional level in the field of wind energy and hydrogen. An MOU without a deadline has been signed, but for the sole purpose of providing a framework for the cooperation activities on a political level. The goal of the cooperation is to internationalize SMEs in Hamburg and in Fukushima and to let the SMEs from both regions collaborate. This is being realized by organizing business meetings for companies from both regions during events such as conventions. Furthermore, fact-finding missions on the business as well as on the political level are being held. Challenges faced in a cooperation scheme related to the internationalization of companies can be divided into roughly two categories. These are conflicts in culture and conflicts in interest. SME members from Hamburg do not know the Japanese culture, and there is a strong belief that there's lots of time needed in order to create a trustworthy relationship with the counterpart prior to the start of actual collaboration activities. This, in addition to the perception that Japanese lack knowledge of the English language and thus there is a need for an expensive interpreter, is discouraging for SMEs in Hamburg. The other challenge, a conflict of interest, arises from the fact that SMEs in Hamburg mainly have the goal to sell their products on the Japanese markets. On the other hand, Japanese counterparts are more interested in collaboration with the goal to get an idea on the German technology in the energy industry in order to produce similar products themselves rather than buying it. Furthermore, German SMEs often face difficulties entering the Japanese energy market because this market is not that open yet for foreign products and because the fierce competition they face by bigger Japanese companies. Benefits of the cooperation between the city-state of Hamburg and Fukushima Prefecture is that both parties are benefiting from the internationalization of their companies, as this is their goal being reached. This has resulted in an increased amount of innovation in both regions, as well as improved bilateral relations between the city-state of Hamburg and Fukushima Prefecture. More success stories, as well as case studies of other types of relevant cooperation, can be found in the report. Based on the survey responses and the interviews, commonly mentioned underlying drivers and challenges for EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation, as well as benefits of such cooperation for SMEs involved, have been discussed. Starting with the underlying drivers, the following trends were identified. The majority of the EU survey respondents, as well as several interviewees who are engaged in EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation, mentioned their wish to support the SMEs in their region in their internationalization process, to let them collaborate with Japanese companies, and to ease their market access to the Japanese market. Other underlying drivers mentioned by EU stakeholders are the aim to access the counterparts network, to complete supply chains, to exchange information, to enhance innovation in the region, to enhance regional development, and the existence of contacts in Japan prior to cooperation. Amongst the Japanese survey respondents, the most commonly mentioned underlying driver was the aim to support local and regional SMEs in their internationalization process and to let them collaborate with EU companies. Another underlying driver mentioned frequently was the aim to enhance innovation in the prefecture. Other types of underlying drivers mentioned by multiple Japanese interviewees were the existence of similar goals for the industry in question, the aim to complete supply chains, and the aim to access the network of the EU counterpart. The most commonly mentioned challenges by EU stakeholders can be categorized into cultural barriers, language barriers, and matters related to funding. Within the cultural barrier category, the amount of time needed to create a trustful relationship prior to starting any collaborative activities, and the amount of time needed for negotiations to create a beneficial cooperation framework for both sides are the most commonly mentioned challenges. In the language barrier category, all EU survey respondents facing this type of challenge mentioned the lack of English language mastery of their Japanese counterpart. Within the funding category, the majority of EU survey respondents indicated that SMEs face difficulties in obtaining enough funding for frequent visits to Japan. Furthermore, EU survey respondents mentioned they face challenges in finding funding from both sides of the cooperation. In some cases, cooperation fully relies on funding from the EU side. Other challenges identified unrelated to the previously mentioned categories are a lack of contacts in Japan, difficulties in entering the Japanese market because of protectionism, and a lack of know-how related to legislative matters. Amongst the Japanese survey respondents and interviewees, the most commonly mentioned challenges were matters related to funding and the identification of good business partners for SMEs and research institutes. Here, difficulties in especially finding matching needs and seats between the EU and the Japanese potential counterparts was perceived as a challenge. Another commonly mentioned challenge by the Japanese survey respondents as well as interviewees was the language barrier between the EU and the Japanese cooperation counterparts. Another challenge mentioned multiple times by the interviewees is the lack of know-how on or interest in internationalization within Japanese SMEs and institutions. Furthermore, some interviewees mentioned competition that arises due to a high degree in similarity between EU and Japanese SMEs within the cooperation scheme as a challenge. Other challenges mentioned by Japanese interviewees are the amount of time needed to develop partnerships between EU and Japanese entities and SMEs, overtakings in management and structures, and creating opportunities for the Japanese and EU partners to meet on an ongoing basis. Both EU and Japanese interviewees often mention that their cooperation opens up many opportunities for their SMEs in terms of internationalization and entering the counterparts' markets. In one case, this was even connected to the economic development that has been taking place in the respective area. Another benefit mentioned by both European and Japanese interviewees was the access gained to the network of their partners, allowing them to form even more partnerships. A benefit mentioned multiple times by organizations involved in R&D was the development of products ready for commercialization and increased opportunities for new joint R&D projects. The increase of innovation in the respective area through the cooperation between Japanese and EU SMEs was also mentioned. Furthermore, as mentioned by some Japanese interviewees, cooperation activities with EU entities has improved their recognition and position worldwide. Other mentioned benefits are the acquisition of useful information and new insights gained by SMEs and research institutions through exchange of information, an increase of exports of SMEs and companies involved in the cooperation, improved bilateral relations between the partners, and successful business matches. Survey respondents were asked how they think organizations promoting all kinds of EU-Japan industrial cooperation, such as the EU-Japan Center, can help to further EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation. Survey respondents were able to choose one or more standardized options provided by the survey. Moreover, the option to share the other kinds of demands not provided by the standardized option was also provided by the survey. From the results of the survey, the following can be concluded. The most frequently requested type of support is the creation of partnering opportunities by organizing events, an online platform, etc. A majority of both EU and Japan survey respondents requested this type of service. A majority of the EU respondents also requested logistical support and market information supply services. This type of service was relatively less popular amongst the Japanese survey respondents. A majority of EU respondents also requested the provision of training programs to better understand the Japanese counterpart. There is a difference in the request of services by type of survey respondent on the EU side. EU clusters and regions almost equally requested every type of service. However, EU regional agencies most frequently requested the supply of logistical support and market information. EU chambers of commerce and industry most frequently requested the creation of partnering opportunities by organizing events, an online platform, etc. All Japanese survey respondents requested the creation of partnering opportunities by organizing events, an online platform, etc. by the center most frequently. Therefore, there is no difference in the request of services by type of survey respondent on the Japanese side. There is also no clear difference between the type of services demanded by survey respondents engaged in EU-Japan cooperation and survey respondents not engaged in EU-Japan cooperation. This is applicable to both the EU survey respondents as well as the Japanese survey respondents. Survey respondents who shared their own ideas on how they think organizations can help to further EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation often mentioned matters related to funding. Interviewees also frequently mentioned the lack of funding as a challenge faced during their EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation. This suggests that there is a lack of funding and/or information about funding opportunities for EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation. Based on the analysis, general recommendations would be to focus on the creation of partnering opportunities while enhancing the access to the supply of logistical support and market information, and providing training programs to better understand the Japanese counterparts for a broad range of EU stakeholders. Moreover, facilitating the access to information about funding opportunities for EU-Japan cooperation projects to both EU and Japanese stakeholders is very important. Now we have reached the end of the podcast, and I would like to thank you for your attention. Please also see the full report, which you can download on the EU-Japan Center for Industrial Cooperation's website. If you have any questions regarding this research or on the general topic of EU-Japan region and cluster cooperation, please contact me anytime.